first, the Japanese thought the American carrier was finished. Not delayed. Not damaged. Finished. On May 8, 1942, thousands of miles across the Pacific, the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown had been hammered during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Her flight deck was damaged. Her hull had taken punishment. She was burning fuel, leaking oil, and carrying the scars of one of the most violent carrier battles the world had ever seen. From the Japanese perspective, this was exactly what a victorious carrier battle was supposed to look like. An American carrier had been crippled. The Japanese had every reason to believe she would need weeks, perhaps months, before she could return to combat. Some estimates were even more optimistic. To Japanese planners preparing their next great operation, the American Pacific Fleet was supposed to be running out of carriers, and that assumption would become one of the most consequential mistakes of the entire Pacific War. Because the carrier they thought had been taken out of the fight did something almost nobody expected. She came back. And she came back incredibly fast. Within roughly 72 hours of reaching Pearl Harbor, American workers had transformed a battered carrier from a damaged veteran of the Coral Sea into a ship capable of sailing into the next battle. That battle was Midway. And what happened there would change the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese had planned an operation designed to destroy the remaining American carriers. Instead, they would discover that one of the carriers they believed was out of action had returned. Her name was Yorktown. And on June 4, 1942, she would help deliver one of the most devastating blows the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever suffered. This is the story of how one damaged American carrier returned from the edge of destruction, and how her unexpected appearance at Midway helped turn Japanese confidence into catastrophe. The Pacific before the storm. 6 months earlier, the Japanese Empire had seemed almost unstoppable. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft had attacked Pearl Harbor. The attack shocked the United States. American battleships burned in the harbor. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Thousands of Americans were killed or wounded. But there was one critical problem with the Japanese victory. The American aircraft carriers were not in port. They survived. That fact would matter enormously, because in the Pacific, carriers were becoming the most powerful weapons afloat. Battleships still represented enormous firepower, but aircraft carriers could strike hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. They could launch bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters without ever seeing the enemy fleet directly. The carrier had changed naval warfare, and both Japan and the United States understood it. By early 1942, Japan had conquered enormous territories across Asia and the Pacific. Singapore had fallen. The Philippines were collapsing. The Dutch East Indies had been attacked. Japanese forces were moving across the Pacific with astonishing speed. But the United States was beginning to recover, and American carriers were beginning to strike back. The USS Enterprise had raided Japanese positions. The USS Lexington was operating in the Pacific, and the USS Yorktown was still fighting. Yorktown had already survived months of war. She had been commissioned in 1937 and had become one of the most experienced American carriers in the Pacific. Her crew knew the ship. They knew her engines. They knew her flight deck. They knew her strengths. And after Pearl Harbor, they knew something else. The war was not going to be decided in a single battle. It would be fought carrier by carrier, aircraft by aircraft, and sailor by sailor. The Battle of the Coral Sea. In May 1942, Japanese forces moved toward Port Moresby in New Guinea. The Japanese plan threatened to expand their defensive perimeter and potentially isolate Australia. American commanders knew they had to respond. The result was the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was unlike traditional naval warfare. The opposing surface fleets rarely saw one another. Instead, aircraft became the weapons. Pilots took off from carriers, crossed enormous stretches of ocean, and searched for enemy ships. The battle became a contest of reconnaissance, timing, navigation, weather, and nerve. On May 7th, American aircraft attacked and sank the Japanese light carrier Shoho. The famous radio message went out, "Scratch one flat top." But the Japanese struck back. On May 8th, aircraft from the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku attacked the American carriers Lexington and Yorktown. The sky filled with aircraft. Dive bombers screamed toward the American ships. Torpedo planes approached low over the water. American fighters attempted to intercept them. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The ocean became a battlefield. Yorktown maneuvered violently. Her crew fought to keep the carrier moving. But Japanese aircraft broke through. Bombs struck the ship. One bomb hit the flight deck and caused significant damage. Other bombs exploded around the carrier. The ship shook violently. Smoke rose into the sky. Men were thrown from their feet. The flight deck was damaged. Yorktown had been hit, but she was still alive. She was still moving. And her crew immediately went to work. Firefighters attacked burning areas. Damage control teams entered compartments filled with smoke. Engineers worked to keep the propulsion system operating. Aircraft crews attempted to recover what they could. The battle continued. By the end of the fighting, both sides had suffered losses. The Japanese had lost Shoho. The Americans had lost Lexington. Yorktown was badly damaged, but she had survived. That survival would become incredibly important. The Japanese believed the damage was enough. From the Japanese perspective, Yorktown looked like a carrier that had been beaten, and strategically that mattered. Japanese planners were already preparing their next major operation. Their target was Midway Atoll. The goal was enormous. Japan wanted to lure the remaining American carriers into battle and destroy them. If successful, the Japanese could potentially eliminate the United States Navy's ability to conduct major offensive operations in the Pacific. The operation depended on intelligence. It depended on surprise. And it depended on knowing how many American carriers could respond. That was where Yorktown became a problem. Japanese intelligence assessed the damage inflicted on the American carrier during the Coral Sea. Their reports suggested that Yorktown had been seriously damaged. The assumption was that she would require substantial repairs. The Japanese believed the American carrier force would therefore be weaker at Midway. But the Americans had a weapon the Japanese could not see. It was not a bomb. It was not a torpedo. It was not a fighter plane. It was industrial capacity. And it was American damage control. The race to Pearl Harbor. After Coral Sea, Yorktown headed toward Pearl Harbor. She was damaged. Her crew was exhausted. The ship needed repairs. Normally, a carrier in that condition would have entered a major repair facility and remained there for an extended period. But there was no time. The next Japanese operation was already approaching. American intelligence had discovered that something major was coming. Cryptanalysts had been working to understand Japanese communications. The American Navy had reason to believe that AF, the Japanese designation for Midway, was the target of a coming operation. Admiral Chester Nimitz had to prepare. But he faced a brutal problem. He needed carriers. And there were not many available. Enterprise was available. Hornet was available. Yorktown was damaged. The question was simple. Could Yorktown fight? Nimitz wanted an answer. The answer from the repair community was essentially this. If the Navy needed her, they would try. Yorktown reached Pearl Harbor on May 27th. The clock started. 72 hours. What happened next became one of the most remarkable repair efforts in American naval history. Yorktown entered the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. Workers immediately surrounded the carrier. Shipyard crews climbed aboard. Engineers inspected the damage. Electricians checked systems. Welders went to work. Carpenters worked inside the ship. Mechanics repaired machinery. Every available hour mattered. Every minute mattered. The ship did not have the luxury of a normal overhaul. There was no time for perfection. There was only time for combat readiness. The carrier needed to be made good enough to fight. That distinction was crucial. American workers were not attempting to restore Yorktown to factory condition. They were attempting to get her back into the Pacific, and they did it with extraordinary speed. For roughly 3 days, Pearl Harbor became a massive repair operation. Workers barely stopped. They patched damaged areas. They repaired the flight deck. They restored machinery. They inspected aircraft handling equipment. They worked through problems that under normal circumstances would have taken much longer. The carrier's crew also worked. Sailors helped clean compartments. Damage control teams assisted engineers. Flight crews prepared aircraft. Everyone understood what was at stake. If Yorktown could leave Pearl Harbor, she could join Enterprise and Hornet. 3 American carriers could potentially meet the Japanese fleet. If Yorktown stayed behind, the Americans would have only 2 fleet carriers available in the immediate battle. That difference could determine the outcome. The repair crews were being asked to do something extraordinary, and they succeeded. On May 30th, only days after arriving at Pearl Harbor, Yorktown departed. The carrier was not perfect. She was not fully repaired. She was wounded, but she could fight, and that was enough. Somewhere in the Pacific, the Japanese were planning. While Yorktown was being repaired, Japanese commanders were preparing their operation. The Japanese plan for Midway was enormous. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed the United States needed to be forced into a decisive fleet battle. Midway was the bait. The Japanese would attack the island. The Americans would respond. Japanese carriers would then destroy the American fleet. At least that was the theory. The plan was built around assumptions. One of those assumptions was that the American carrier force had been heavily weakened. Yorktown was believed to be damaged. Lexington was gone. Saratoga was unavailable. The Americans therefore appeared to have only Enterprise and Hornet immediately available. That was a major advantage. The Japanese planned to bring 4 fleet carriers into the operation. Akagi, Kaga, Soryo, Hiryu. These ships had formed the core of the Japanese carrier striking force. Their pilots were among the most experienced aviators in the world. They had attacked Pearl Harbor. They had fought across the Pacific. They had destroyed enemy ships with devastating precision. Japanese carrier aviation had developed an extraordinary reputation. And on paper the Japanese force looked terrifying. But there was one thing the Japanese planners did not know. Yorktown was coming. The American trap. The Americans knew something the Japanese did not. They knew the Japanese were coming. American codebreakers had intercepted and interpreted enough Japanese communications to determine that Midway was the target. Admiral Nimitz positioned his carriers north of Midway. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Americans were no longer waiting blindly. They were waiting in ambush. That completely changed the balance. The Japanese believed they were approaching an American force that did not fully know what was coming. Instead, the Americans were preparing to attack the Japanese carrier fleet. And Yorktown was at the center of that plan. Her arrival was more than a reinforcement, was a surprise. A carrier the Japanese believed was crippled was suddenly part of the American battle line. The Japanese had planned around 3 American carriers being unavailable or out of position. Instead, 3 American carriers were waiting. The difference would become catastrophic. June 4, 1942. Before sunrise on June 4th, Japanese aircraft began launching from their carriers. The sea was dark. The ships moved through the Pacific. Aircraft crews prepared bombs and torpedoes. Engines roared. One aircraft after another lifted from the Japanese carriers. The first major strike headed toward Midway Atoll. Japanese commanders expected to find an American base that could be destroyed. But they did not yet know where the American carriers were. That question would become everything. The Japanese attack on Midway caused significant damage. But it did not destroy the American airfield. And the American aircraft were already launching. From the American carriers, planes began taking off. Enterprise launched aircraft, Hornet launched aircraft, and Yorktown launched aircraft. The carrier that had been damaged at Coral Sea was now sending aircraft into battle. This was the moment the Japanese plan began to unravel. The American torpedo squadrons. American aircraft searched for the Japanese fleet. Finding enemy carriers in the enormous Pacific was incredibly difficult. There was no radar-guided satellite system, no GPS, no digital navigation. Pilots depended on maps, compasses, dead reckoning, radio signals, and their own eyes. Some American aircraft became separated. Some ran low on fuel. Some searched in the wrong direction. But eventually, American forces found the Japanese carriers. The first attacks came from American torpedo squadrons. Their aircraft flew low, very low. They approached Japanese carriers at an altitude that exposed them to fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The torpedo planes were slow. Their defenses were limited. Japanese Zero fighters attacked them. One after another, American torpedo aircraft were destroyed. The attacks were devastating for the American squadrons. But something extraordinary was happening. The Japanese combat air patrol was being pulled down toward the low-flying torpedo planes. The Japanese carriers were maneuvering. Their fighters were engaged. Their flight decks were becoming crowded. And above them, another group of American aircraft was approaching. Dive bombers. They were about to arrive at precisely the moment the Japanese carrier force was most vulnerable. The sky falls on the Japanese fleet. American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers. They came from high above. Then they dove. The aircraft accelerated toward the sea. The Japanese ships opened fire. Anti-aircraft guns fired upward. But the American pilots continued their dives. Bombs were released. Then the aircraft pulled out. The first Japanese carriers began burning. Akagi, Kaga, Soryo. 3 carriers were devastated in a matter of minutes. The Japanese carrier fleet had been transformed. Only Hiryu remained operational. The situation was almost impossible to believe. Japan had entered the battle expecting to destroy American carriers. Now 3 Japanese carriers were burning. The 4th would soon strike back. And this is where Yorktown's story becomes even more extraordinary. Hiryu strikes back. The Japanese carrier Hiryu launched aircraft against the Americans. Her pilots searched for the American carriers. Eventually they found Yorktown. The carrier that had survived Coral Sea was about to face another attack. Japanese aircraft approached. Yorktown's fighters engaged them. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. But the Japanese attack broke through. Yorktown was hit. Again. Bombs struck the carrier. Smoke rose from the ship. The flight deck was damaged. The ship listed. Then came another wave. Torpedo aircraft attacked. Yorktown attempted to maneuver. But torpedoes entered the water. The carrier turned. Some weapons missed. Others did not. Yorktown was struck by torpedoes. The ship's condition deteriorated rapidly. She lost power. She began listing heavily. For a moment, it appeared the Japanese had finally done what they had expected to happen at Coral Sea. Yorktown was crippled. But the American crew refused to surrender the ship. Damage control teams rushed into action. Sailors fought fires. Engineers attempted to restore power. Crewmen moved through flooded compartments. They worked inside a ship that was becoming increasingly dangerous. Yorktown had been damaged at Coral Sea. She had been repaired in 3 days. She had crossed the Pacific. She had fought at Midway. And now she was being attacked again. But even after the second attack, she remained part of the battle. The final Japanese carrier. The Japanese still had one carrier, Hiryu. For several hours, Hiryu remained a threat. Her aircraft had damaged Yorktown. Japanese commanders still believed they might reverse the battle. But American aircraft located Hiryu. Bombers attacked. Hiryu was hit. The Japanese carrier burned. Her flight deck was destroyed. Her aircraft operations ended. The last of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers had been knocked out. The Japanese carrier force that had sailed toward Midway with overwhelming confidence had been shattered. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, all 4 were lost. The United States had also suffered losses. Many American aircraft had been destroyed. Many pilots never returned. Yorktown herself was mortally damaged. But strategically, the result was devastating for Japan. The Japanese Navy had lost 4 of its most important fleet carriers, and with them, hundreds of experienced aviators were lost. That loss could not be repaired in 72 hours. It could not be repaired in a shipyard. It could not be replaced simply by building new aircraft. The experienced carrier crews were gone, and Japan would spend the rest of the war paying for that loss. The carrier that refused to stay down. Yorktown's story did not end on June 4th. The carrier was still afloat. Despite everything that had happened, American crews continued fighting to save her. She was damaged. She was listing. But salvage operations began. Tugs attempted to assist. Sailors worked around the clock. The ship's crew had already performed an extraordinary feat once. Now they were trying to keep her alive again. For a time, it looked as though they might succeed. Yorktown was eventually taken under tow. But on June 7th, Japanese submarine I-168 attacked. Torpedoes struck. Yorktown was hit again. The carrier's condition became critical. She finally capsized and sank. The ship that had survived Coral Sea, raced to Pearl Harbor, returned to the fleet, fought at Midway, and survived multiple attacks, was finally gone. But by then she had already accomplished something enormous. She had helped destroy the Japanese carrier force. Her aircraft had contributed to the attack. Her presence had changed Japanese calculations. Her very existence at Midway had surprised an enemy that believed she was unavailable. Yorktown had become a symbol of American resilience. Why 72 hours mattered. The most important part of this story is not simply that American workers repaired a carrier quickly. It is why that speed mattered. Naval warfare is often described through weapons, ships, aircraft, bombs, torpedoes. But wars are also decided by logistics, factories, repair yards, fuel, spare parts, engineers, mechanics, and the ability to turn damaged equipment back into combat power. The Japanese had superb ships. They had highly trained pilots. They had an experienced carrier fleet. But the United States possessed an enormous industrial system, and Pearl Harbor demonstrated the importance of that system. Yorktown was damaged. The Americans did not say, "We will wait until she is perfect." They asked, "How quickly can we make her capable of fighting?" The answer was astonishing. 3 days. Approximately 72 hours after reaching Pearl Harbor, Yorktown was back at sea. Not fully restored, not untouched, not brand new, but operational. And that was enough. The Japanese calculation that failed. The Japanese plan depended on knowing the American strength. That was one of its fundamental weaknesses. If Yorktown was unavailable, the Americans had fewer carriers. If Yorktown was available, the balance changed. The Japanese believed she was too damaged to participate. They were wrong. That single mistake became part of a larger intelligence failure. The Japanese did not know exactly how much the Americans knew about the Midway operation. They did not know the American carriers were waiting. They did not fully appreciate the strength of American code breaking, and they underestimated how quickly the Americans could recover from damage. This was not one isolated mistake. It was a chain of assumptions, and each assumption pushed the Japanese commanders toward greater confidence, until they encountered the American fleet. And then everything changed. The human side of the repair. Imagine standing on the deck of Yorktown at Pearl Harbor. The carrier has just returned from battle. She is scarred. The men aboard her are exhausted. Some of their friends are dead. The ship smells of smoke, fuel, salt water, and machinery. Around you, workers are arriving. They are climbing aboard. They are carrying tools. They are bringing equipment. There is no ceremonial pause. No long recovery period. No guarantee that the repairs will work. There is only a deadline. Midway. The shipyard workers know that if they fail, fewer American carriers will be available. They know that somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese ships are approaching. The sailors know the same thing. And everyone works. Welders work through the night. Electricians repair damaged systems. Engineers inspect machinery. Painters and carpenters repair sections of the ship. Damage control specialists inspect compartments. Flight crews prepare aircraft. Commanders study maps. The carrier becomes a moving construction site. And then, after roughly 3 days, the order comes. Yorktown is leaving. She heads back into the Pacific. That moment represents something much larger than one ship. It represents the ability of an industrial nation to recover from a battlefield setback almost immediately. The Japanese had won battles before Midway. It is important to understand why Japanese commanders were so confident. They were not foolish. They were not incompetent. They had won a series of extraordinary victories. The Japanese Navy had attacked Pearl Harbor. It had destroyed or damaged major Allied naval forces. It had conquered territory at incredible speed. Japanese carrier pilots were among the most experienced combat aviators in the world. Their commanders had reason to believe they possessed an advantage, but success can create dangerous assumptions. When an army or navy wins repeatedly, commanders can begin expecting the next victory. They can become convinced that the enemy will respond exactly as predicted. At Midway, the Japanese believed the Americans would be reacting to them. Instead, the Japanese were entering an American trap, and one of the carriers waiting for them was the carrier they believed they had already crippled. The battle that changed the Pacific. Midway did not instantly end the war. Japan remained extremely powerful. The Japanese military still controlled enormous territories. The United States still faced years of fighting. But Midway changed the strategic direction of the war. Before Midway, Japan was largely advancing. After Midway, the Japanese increasingly faced an American offensive. The loss of 4 fleet carriers was enormous. These were not simply steel hulls. They were floating airfields. They carried aircraft. They carried maintenance crews. They carried fuel. They carried experienced pilots. They carried commanders. And they represented years of training. Replacing a carrier was difficult. Replacing an experienced carrier pilot was even harder. The United States would eventually produce enormous numbers of ships and aircraft. Japan could not match that scale. The balance was shifting, and Yorktown's unexpected appearance had played a role in the turning point. What if Yorktown had stayed in Pearl Harbor? Imagine an alternate June 4th. Enterprise and Hornet are waiting. Yorktown is still in Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack begins. 2 American carriers face 4 Japanese fleet carriers. The battle might have unfolded very differently. History can never tell us exactly what would have happened, but we know something important. Yorktown's presence gave the Americans another carrier group, another flight deck, another collection of aircraft, another set of pilots, another commander, another target for the Japanese. And eventually, Yorktown's aircraft participated directly in the attacks that destroyed Japanese carriers. Without Yorktown, the American attack might have been weaker. The timing could have changed. The number of available aircraft could have changed. The Japanese carrier force might have had more freedom to maneuver. We cannot rewrite history, but we can understand the importance of what actually happened. A ship that should have been sitting in a repair yard was instead fighting at the decisive moment. The power of American repair crews. Military history often celebrates admirals and pilots. Names like Nimitz and Spruance became famous. Pilots who attacked Japanese carriers became heroes. But Yorktown's return also belonged to people whose names were never written in headlines. Shipyard workers, welders, electricians, mechanics, engineers, sailors, damage control crews, men who worked behind the scenes. They were not flying aircraft over Japanese carriers. They were not commanding fleets. But without them, the aircraft could not have taken off. Without them, Yorktown would have remained in Pearl Harbor. Without them, 3 American carriers might have become 2. And history might have looked very different. Their contribution was invisible until the moment it became decisive. A carrier built for war. Yorktown was part of the Yorktown-class carriers built by the United States before the war. She was designed around the idea that aircraft carriers would operate as the heart of naval task forces. She had a large flight deck. She could carry aircraft. She could launch and recover planes repeatedly. Her elevators moved aircraft between the hangar deck and flight deck. Her crew maintained engines, weapons, aircraft, communications, navigation systems, and countless other components. A carrier was not simply a ship. It was a city that moved through the ocean. Thousands of people depended on hundreds of systems working together. Damage one critical system and the entire ship could become vulnerable. That is why Yorktown's survival at Coral Sea was so important. And that is why her rapid repair was so impressive. The American Navy had learned to treat damage control as a battlefield skill. A bomb hit did not automatically mean a ship was lost. A fire did not automatically mean abandonment. A damaged engine did not automatically mean surrender. The crew fought the damage. They isolated compartments. They controlled fires. They pumped water. They restored power. They kept the ship moving. This culture of damage control would save American ships repeatedly throughout the Pacific War. The difference between damage and destruction. Yorktown demonstrated a critical principle. A ship can be badly damaged and still remain useful. The Japanese saw the damage. The Americans saw the remaining capability. That difference in perspective mattered. From a distance, Yorktown looked like a carrier that had been badly beaten. But the Americans asked a different question. What does she still have? Can she move? Can she launch aircraft? Can she fight? If the answer was yes, she was still a weapon. This mentality became one of the strengths of the American war effort. The United States had the resources to repair damaged ships. It had ports. It had shipyards. It had workers. It had spare parts. It had factories. And it had a command structure willing to take calculated risks. Yorktown became one of the most dramatic examples. The moment the Japanese realized. There was a moment during Midway when the Japanese learned that the Americans had more carrier strength than expected. That realization was devastating. The Japanese had not planned to face Yorktown as part of the American carrier force. Suddenly, the assumptions underlying their operation were collapsing. The Americans were not simply defending Midway. They were attacking. And the Japanese carrier force was exposed. The enemy they expected to be weaker was stronger. The carrier they expected to be damaged was present. The surprise belonged to the Americans. And in carrier warfare, surprise could mean everything. A carrier could be destroyed in minutes. Aircraft sitting on deck with fuel and weapons could turn into an enormous vulnerability. That is essentially what happened. American aircraft arrived at a critical moment. The Japanese carriers were caught in a dangerous transition. Aircraft were being prepared. Weapons were being handled. Fuel was being moved. The Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn away. Then the American dive bombers appeared. The result was catastrophic. 4 carriers in minutes. The destruction of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu happened with astonishing speed. These ships had been among the most feared carriers in the world. They had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had helped drive Japanese expansion. Now they were burning. Hiryu would later join them. The loss was not just material. It was psychological. The Japanese Navy had entered Midway expecting to deliver a decisive blow. Instead, its elite carrier striking force had been devastated. The war had exposed a weakness that would become increasingly important. Japan could build ships. But the United States could build ships at an extraordinary rate. Japan could train pilots. But replacing elite combat veterans was much harder. The Japanese carrier force had been built around quality. The American war effort increasingly combined quality with enormous quantity. Midway was where those two systems collided. Yorktown's last battle. Yorktown was already damaged when she fought at Midway. That makes her performance even more remarkable. She was not entering the battle as a fresh carrier. She had already been through Coral Sea. She had undergone emergency repairs. She had sailed from Pearl Harbor. And she had been sent directly into another major battle. Then Japanese aircraft attacked her. She was hit. She was damaged again. Yet her crew continued. Aircraft continued operating. Damage control teams continued fighting. The ship remained a participant in the battle. Eventually she could not be saved. But the fact that she survived as long as she did demonstrated the extraordinary resilience of both the ship and her crew. Yorktown had essentially been given a second life. That second life lasted only days. But those days were enough to alter history. The men who kept her moving. A carrier's survival depends on thousands of decisions. Someone has to close a valve. Someone has to repair a cable. Someone has to put out a fire. Someone has to restart an engine. Someone has to clear the flight deck. Someone has to move an aircraft. Someone has to carry ammunition. Someone has to report damage. Someone has to make the decision to keep fighting. During Yorktown's final days, those jobs were performed under extreme pressure. There was no guarantee the ship would survive. But the crew continued. That is the human element behind the statistics. 4 Japanese carriers lost. 1 American carrier lost. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed. Hundreds of men killed. But behind every number was a person. A pilot. A mechanic. A sailor. A commander. A shipyard worker. A family waiting at home. Midway was not simply a battle on a map. It was thousands of individual acts of courage and sacrifice. Why the story still matters. More than 80 years later, the story of Yorktown still carries a powerful lesson. Wars are rarely decided by one weapon. They are decided by systems. Intelligence. Logistics. Training. Leadership. Industry. Maintenance. Morale. And the ability to recover from failure. The Japanese believed Yorktown's damage meant she was out of the fight. The Americans believed damage was a problem that could be solved. That difference mattered. A damaged carrier became a repaired carrier. A repaired carrier became an operational carrier. An operational carrier became part of the force waiting at Midway, and that force destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers. The chain began with a damaged ship. It ended with a strategic turning point, the race against time. Imagine the countdown. May 27th. Yorktown enters Pearl Harbor. 3 days. That is all. 3 days to inspect the damage. 3 days to repair the ship. 3 days to prepare aircraft. 3 days to prepare the crew. 3 days to make the carrier capable of combat. Then May 30th, she leaves. That means there is almost no margin for error. If a repair fails, there is no time for a second attempt. If machinery breaks, there is no extended dock period. If aircraft equipment malfunctions, there is no weeks-long testing program. Everything has to work, and somehow enough of it does. Yorktown heads toward Midway. She is wounded, but she is coming. The Japanese plan meets reality. The Japanese operation had been designed on paper, for carriers. An American fleet expected to be weakened. A surprise attack. A decisive battle. A victory that would secure Japanese dominance in the Pacific. But war does not follow paper plans. Yorktown's rapid repair changed the equation. American codebreakers changed the equation. American reconnaissance changed the equation. The Japanese attack on Midway did not produce the expected result, and the American carriers were waiting. One of those carriers was Yorktown. The Japanese had not expected her, and they paid for that mistake. The carrier that came back. The title of this story sounds almost unbelievable. A carrier damaged in one battle, repaired in approximately 72 hours after reaching Pearl Harbor, then sent into another battle. And in that next battle, she helps destroy the enemy carrier force that was supposed to dominate the Pacific. But this is not a legend created after the war. The timeline is real. The damage was real. The repairs were real. The voyage was real. The battle was real. And the consequences were enormous. Yorktown's return demonstrated something that Japanese commanders had not fully appreciated. The United States could absorb damage and recover incredibly quickly. That ability would become one of America's greatest strategic advantages. What the Japanese lost at Midway. The loss of the 4 carriers was devastating. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Iryu. These ships represented the core of Japanese carrier power. They had experienced crews. They carried veteran aviators. They represented years of investment. Their destruction created a hole that Japan could not easily fill. The United States would continue building carriers. More importantly, the United States would train new generations of pilots and sailors. American industrial capacity would expand dramatically. The Pacific War would become a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, industrial capacity mattered enormously. The Japanese had expected a short war. Instead, they were pulled into a conflict in which the United States could replace losses faster than Japan could. Midway accelerated that realization. The final image. Picture Yorktown one last time. June 1942. The Pacific stretches endlessly in every direction. The carrier is wounded. Her flight deck carries the marks of battle. Her crew is exhausted. Her machinery has been pushed beyond what anyone would consider normal. But she is still there. For a brief moment, the carrier that was supposed to have disappeared after Coral Sea is fighting again. She had crossed thousands of miles. She had survived one battle. She had been repaired in 3 days. She had entered another battle. And she had helped change the course of the Pacific War. Then the torpedoes came. The ship could not survive forever. Yorktown finally slipped beneath the Pacific. But by then, the Japanese carrier force had already been destroyed. The ship was gone. The impact remained, the legacy of Yorktown. Yorktown became a symbol of American resilience. Not because she was invincible. She was not. She was damaged repeatedly. She eventually sank. Her crew suffered terrible losses. But she demonstrated something perhaps more important than invincibility. She demonstrated recovery. She demonstrated that being damaged did not necessarily mean being defeated. She demonstrated that a ship could be wounded and still return to battle. And she demonstrated the power of people working together under impossible pressure. The Japanese had counted Yorktown as a damaged asset. The Americans turned her into an active weapon. That difference helped decide the battle. The hidden weapon. There is a tendency to look at Midway and focus entirely on the pilots, the dive bombers, the torpedo squadrons, the fighter pilots, the commanders. But another weapon was operating in the background. American industry. Every aircraft that launched from Yorktown depended on factories. Every engine depended on manufacturing. Every bomb depended on supply lines. Every repair depended on tools and materials. Every sailor depended on food, fuel, ammunition, and equipment. The United States had entered the war with an industrial base capable of supporting an enormous conflict. Yorktown's 72-hour repair was a preview of what was coming. America was not simply learning how to fight. America was learning how to replace, repair, and rebuild faster than its enemies could destroy. The lesson of 72 hours. The most powerful part of the Yorktown story may be the simplest. The Japanese believed they had bought time. They believed Yorktown's damage meant one less American carrier. They built their plan around that assumption. But the Americans did not give them the time. Workers repaired the carrier. Sailors prepared her. Commanders sent her. Pilots flew from her. And suddenly the carrier was back. 72 hours was enough to transform a damaged ship into a combat-ready weapon. That is why the story matters. Because sometimes history turns on something that looks insignificant. A repair job. A few days. A ship that should have been sitting in a harbor. A decision to send her anyway. At Midway those details collided. The turning point. Before Midway, Japan had momentum. After Midway, the United States increasingly seized the initiative. The war would still be long. There would be Guadalcanal. There would be the Solomon Islands. There would be the Philippines. There would be Iwo Jima. There would be Okinawa. There would be years of fighting. But Midway marked a fundamental shift. Japan had attempted to destroy America's remaining carrier strength. Instead, Japan lost 4 of its most important carriers. And one of the American carriers present was the very ship Japanese planners had assumed was crippled. Yorktown. The carrier that came back. A ship that changed history twice. Yorktown had already played an important role at Coral Sea. She helped prevent the Japanese from achieving their objectives around Port Moresby. Then she returned to Pearl Harbor. She was repaired. She went to Midway. And there she helped participate in the destruction of the Japanese carrier force. In that sense, Yorktown fought 2 battles that helped shape the Pacific War. At Coral Sea she survived. At Midway she returned. And after Midway she became a symbol. Her final sinking did not erase what she had accomplished. Sometimes a ship's greatest contribution comes not from surviving the war, but from surviving long enough to change it. The men at Pearl Harbor. When people remember Midway, they remember the explosions. The burning Japanese carriers. The aircraft diving from the sky. The desperate torpedo attacks. But somewhere behind all of that was a group of workers who had spent 3 days repairing a damaged carrier. They may never have known exactly how important their work would become. They simply did their jobs. They worked. They repaired. They welded. They tested. They replaced. They prepared. And then Yorktown sailed. Those 72 hours became part of the battle. Every repair became part of the battle. Every bolt tightened. Every cable repaired. Every system restored. Every hour of labor. All of it traveled with the carrier toward Midway. And when American aircraft took off from Yorktown, they carried more than bombs and torpedoes. They carried the work of everyone who had rushed to get the carrier back into the Pacific. The carrier the Japanese couldn't count on. The Japanese commanders planned around what they believed the American Navy could do. But Yorktown represented something they could not accurately measure. American recovery. American repair capacity. American determination. They could count ships. They could estimate aircraft. They could analyze intelligence reports. But it was harder to measure how quickly the United States could turn a damaged carrier back into a fighting ship. That was the hidden variable. And at Midway, that variable appeared on the horizon. Yorktown was back. The price of victory. But victory came at a price. The United States lost many aircraft. Many pilots were killed. Yorktown was eventually lost. The Japanese also suffered enormous casualties. The battle was brutal. There was nothing clean or simple about it. Midway was a victory, but it was not painless. For the people who fought there, it was terrifying. Aircraft crews took off knowing they might never return. Sailors remained at their stations while bombs and torpedoes attacked their ships. Damage control crews entered burning compartments. Men performed their duties under conditions that could kill them at any moment. The strategic result would later be described in a few sentences. 4 Japanese carriers lost. 1 American carrier lost. But those words cannot capture the reality. The battle was fought by human beings. The moment that became history when the Japanese saw American aircraft arriving over their carriers, they did not see the entire American industrial system. They saw aircraft. They saw bombs. They saw the enemy. But behind those aircraft was something much larger. A country mobilizing its industry. A navy learning from its mistakes. A repair yard working around the clock. A carrier crew refusing to give up. A commander willing to take a damaged ship into battle. And intelligence officers who had helped reveal where the Japanese fleet was going. All of those elements came together at Midway. Yorktown was one part of that enormous machine, but she was a crucial part. The final lesson. History often remembers the moment of destruction. The bombs falling. The ships burning. The victory being announced. But sometimes the real turning point happens earlier. In a repair yard. In a workshop. In a warehouse. In a planning room. In the hands of people nobody will ever see in a documentary. Yorktown's story is one of those moments. The Japanese believed they had crippled an American carrier. The Americans looked at the damage and asked how quickly they could repair it. The answer was roughly 72 hours after Yorktown reached Pearl Harbor. 3 days. 3 days later, she was sailing back toward the battle. And less than a week after leaving Pearl Harbor, she was fighting at Midway. The Japanese had planned for a weakened American carrier force. Instead, they found Yorktown. They had planned to destroy American carriers. Instead, Japanese carriers were destroyed. They had expected the United States to react. Instead, the Americans were waiting. And the carrier that was supposed to be out of the war became part of the force that changed it. The carrier that refused to disappear. Yorktown's story ends beneath the Pacific, but the idea behind it never disappeared. The ship went down. The lesson remained. A nation at war is not measured only by the ships it has. It is measured by how quickly it can rebuild the ships it loses. It is measured by how quickly it can repair the ships it damages. It is measured by the people willing to work through the night. It is measured by commanders willing to use what they have. And it is measured by crews willing to fight even when their ship has already been written off by the enemy. Yorktown was written off. Then she came back. That is what makes her story so extraordinary. Not that she survived forever. She didn't. Not that she was invincible. She wasn't. But when the Japanese believed they had removed her from the equation, she returned at exactly the moment she was needed. And at Midway, that return helped create a battle that changed the Pacific forever. She was tired. Her crew knew she had already been through one battle. They knew another was coming. But they went anyway. That is the image that should remain. Not simply the carrier burning. Not simply the carrier sinking. But the carrier moving toward the fight. A damaged ship. A repaired ship. A determined crew. A flight deck preparing aircraft. And an enemy that believed she should not have been there. Yorktown had already survived once. She would survive long enough to make her contribution. Then the Pacific would claim her. But by then the battle had been decided. The Japanese carrier force was broken. The balance of power was shifting. And the United States had demonstrated that even after taking enormous damage, it could rebuild and return to the fight almost immediately. The name Yorktown. Today, Yorktown is remembered as one of the most famous American carriers of World War II. Her story is connected forever to Coral Sea and Midway. She represents the courage of her crew. She represents the determination of American shipyard workers. She represents the importance of intelligence. She represents the growing power of naval aviation. And she represents the danger of assuming that an enemy is finished simply because you have damaged one of its weapons. The Japanese thought Yorktown was crippled. They thought she needed time. They thought she would not be waiting at Midway. They were wrong. And that mistake became one of the most important mistakes of the Pacific War. The 72-hour miracle. 3 days. Approximately 72 hours. That was the window. A damaged carrier entered Pearl Harbor. A repair operation began. The clock kept moving. The Japanese fleet was approaching. The Americans needed every carrier they could get. Workers pushed themselves. Sailors pushed themselves. Engineers pushed themselves. And Yorktown left. There was no guarantee that she would survive. There was no guarantee that the repairs would hold. There was no guarantee that she would even reach Midway in time. But she did. And when she arrived, she was not a memory from the Battle of the Coral Sea. She was a fighting carrier. She launched aircraft. She absorbed another attack. She continued operating. And she helped destroy the Japanese carrier force. That is why the story of Yorktown is bigger than one ship. It is a story about speed, resilience, intelligence, industry, and the unpredictable nature of war. The moment Japan lost the initiative, the Pacific War did not end at Midway. But something important ended there. The assumption that Japan could continue expanding without facing a powerful American counterattack. The Japanese Navy remained dangerous. But its most experienced carrier force had been shattered. The Americans had learned that they could defeat Japanese carriers. And the United States began preparing for a long war. From that point forward, American industrial power would become increasingly difficult for Japan to overcome. New carriers would appear. New aircraft would appear. New pilots would be trained. New ships would enter the Pacific. The war machine would continue growing. And the Japanese would increasingly find themselves fighting an opponent whose ability to recover seemed almost endless. Yorktown was one of the first dramatic examples of that reality. The story behind the story. The headline is simple. A Japanese attack crippled an American carrier. 3 days later, the carrier was back in action. But the real story is much deeper. It is about two different approaches to war. One side believed that a damaged carrier could be removed from the equation. The other side believed that damage was temporary if enough people worked quickly enough. One side planned around an estimate. The other side changed the estimate. One side expected a weakened enemy. The other side arrived with a carrier that should not have been there. And in the chaos of Midway, those differences became decisive. On June 7, 1942, Yorktown finally sank. She disappeared beneath the Pacific Ocean. But her story had already become permanent. The ship that had survived Coral Sea. The ship that had been rushed into Pearl Harbor. The ship that workers repaired in approximately 72 hours. The ship that sailed back into the Pacific. The ship that appeared at Midway when the Japanese did not expect her. The ship that fought again. The ship that helped defeat 4 Japanese carriers. And finally, the ship that went down after giving everything she had. Yorktown did not survive the war. But she did something more important. She survived long enough to help change the war. And that is why her story still matters. Because sometimes history does not turn on the largest ship. It turns on the ship that everyone thought was finished. Sometimes victory does not come from having an undamaged force. It comes from repairing what remains. Sometimes the enemy's greatest mistake is believing you cannot come back. And sometimes, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, a damaged carrier appears on the horizon when nobody expected her. Her flight deck is scarred. Her crew is exhausted. Her engines are running. Her aircraft are ready. And she's coming back to fight. The Japanese thought Yorktown was finished. The Americans had other plans. And at Midway, that difference helped change the course of history.